It's something that's likely happened to all of us. You're grocery shopping and you see a girl outside the store asking for money. You may not realize this, but there's a high likelihood she's being trafficked. Here's the thing. The majority of girls trafficked here aren't kidnapped tourists with Liam Neeson coming for their captors.
They do have a very particular set of skills. I will find you.
So what's bringing so many of them into this hell? And what's keeping them there? And what can we do to free them? That's what we'll be answering on this episode of the Edify podcast. I am joined by Haley McNamara, who is the Vice President of Strategy and Communication at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. Haley, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
A record number of people saw the new movie, The Sound of Freedom. Broadly speaking, is this film representative of the current trafficking pandemic?
Yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon how much this movie's taken off, because I think it does portray the way that a lot of sex trafficking happens. Although I would say it is honest about this in the movie. What they're primarily portraying is sex trafficking that's happening outside of the United States. And so I think that, it does portray a reality, unfortunately, for many victims and survivors. But in the United States, it does look a bit different. So I think that there's a lot to chat about there.
Okay, well then let's talk about that. What is the average person in the United States? We're talking about victims, young women or young men who are being trafficked here. What are the signs to look for, and what's the average American missing when we're talking about trying to be aware of where a victim might be or who might be being trapped? What does it look like here in this country, Haley?
Yeah, so people who might have seen The Sound of Freedom, or maybe the movie Taken with Liam Neeson a number of years ago, very often think about sex trafficking as someone who's been maybe literally physically kidnapped, taken, transported across state lines, across country lines, maybe even literally held in chains. And this is a person who, as soon as police knock down the door, they would run towards the police and say, help me, I'm a victim. But the reality is, while those situations definitely do happen, most sex trafficking in the United States happens domestically with domestic victims. So some of it does happen across borders from different countries, but the vast majority, I think over 90%, happens domestically.
So by domestically, what do you mean by that? U.S. citizens trafficking other U.S. citizens? Is that what you mean? Okay. Is there a typical then fact pattern or scenario that would identify a victim of sex trafficking? We should probably just talk too about minors versus adults, because both can be trafficked and exploited.
Right. So the definition of sex trafficking is any kind of commercial sex act that is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, and any commercial sex act of a minor. So if you're under 18, whether you're being given money or anything of value, it could even be drugs or a safe place to sleep that night in exchange for any kind of sexual activity, that is by definition sex trafficking. And then if you're adult, there's force, fraud, or coercion. And I think that coercion piece is the piece that people often miss with sex trafficking, because there can be force, there can be fraud, like blackmail, it often happens, but that psychological coercion is the way that very often happens, where sometimes it's called a Romeo pimp, where someone is groomed to believe that they're in a loving relationship with the person, and kind of akin to what we see with domestic violence, where manipulation and grooming starts to escalate. And in this case, it escalates into a commercial kind of sexual exploitation. And so some signs that people can look out for would include, especially whether it's a minor, but even an adult as well, if they have a relationship that is suddenly, escalating very quickly in the level of commitment, the level of, sometimes people use the phrase like love bombing, the emotional attachment seems to escalate very quickly if something just feels a bit wrong, especially with minors. If someone's been contacted by someone online that maybe they think is a friend of a friend, but you don't really have verification of that, that's something to really look out for. And then there's, other signs as well, such as, someone starts becoming secretive about a relationship, not being able to share about it. And then, some other examples would be if they start having gifts or money that you can't really explain, especially if they're a child, but it could be with adults as well. And some very classic examples of trafficking scenarios might as well be if someone doesn't have control of their own passport, or if they suddenly have large amounts of time that they can't really account for, all of these things. But sometimes it can be quite nuanced. Mm-hmm.
I did a little bit of work on this issue in my own home state, in sort of an ancillary way. And one of the things that I learned I was not aware of in speaking to some people in law enforcement was that, the average young woman, say teenager, who's being exploited, often the scenario is something like this. She's like, as you just mentioned, she's contacted by someone who's a friend of a friend online, love bombing, all that other kind of stuff. She agrees to send him some naked pictures. And all of a sudden she's being blackmailed. So every day after school, her parents think she's going to study with a friend or she's involved in some activity. And she's home by 6 o'clock. She's home for dinner every night. But the reality of the fact is that she's out, between 3 and 6, she's being trafficked. And then she's home and this person is holding these pictures over her head, threatening to send them to her family and to her school, et cetera, et cetera. Is that something, how, so if you suspect something like this, what are signs to look for? Like you said, unexplained money or large amounts of time that goes unaccounted for. Anything else we might be missing in a situation like that, Haley?
Yeah, I think the general, any kind of secretness around a relationship. But it's a very difficult, like that scenario that you explained is very common. We hear those kinds of stories all the time. And so I think very often parents will, especially parents, thinking about their children and wanting to keep them safe, they'll think, oh, well, my child is in a loving home. Maybe we, do XYZ activity together. Maybe they have this or that in their community. So they have all these protective factors. But by nature of a child having really any online access, unfortunately, in today's day and age, they all do, there is this risk, and especially of that extortion piece. So it gets very difficult to know some of those signs. I think a lot of it has to come in the context of your own relationship with the person and recognizing mood shifts, behavioral shifts, especially if we're thinking about a scenario like you just described, a parent, possessiveness over their phone, and really wanting to hide things on their phone from you. Those are some signs.
Right. I mean, and you just think of the terror that must exist in a poor girl's heart and mind if that's happening to her. It's would a young boy exhibit? Are the same scenarios used with young boys? I mean, we know it's boys as well as girls who are trafficked, or are there any signs or symptoms that would be different in a young man?
It definitely happens to young boys as well. I think there's even an increase in how much it's happening to young boys, because people will pose as, young women messaging them and asking to trade images. This actually happened. So at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, we do public policy, corporate advocacy, and we also have a law center which represents survivors. And we have a case right now in a lawsuit against Twitter in the case of 2 boys who are 13 years old. They were messaged on Snapchat by someone pretending to be an older woman, convinced them to send nude images and eventually videos of themselves. And then those were shared and commercialized on Twitter. And actually the boys and their mom reached out to Twitter to let them know, this was them. They were clearly minors. It's child sexual abuse material, which is contraband under United States federal law. And Twitter left it up and let it continue getting views.
Can you explain to our listeners what you mean by that? Does that mean the video was being sold, or in what way was it commercialized? What's the definition of that in this context?
Sold, and then in this context, in our lawsuit against Twitter specifically, there were ads running alongside the video. So we are arguing that Twitter allowed this to remain up and was receiving ad revenue alongside this tweet. But all of that to say, this definitely happens to both boys and girls and adults as well. And I think sometimes parents might think, well, my child's a quote unquote good kid. They would never send that. But remember, even like a good kid, they're still kids. And these are predatory adults who are skilled and practiced at manipulating young people to take actions that they might otherwise not. Mm-hmm.
And, and it's so hard to know when someone might just be a person who's fallen on hard times or someone who's, And, you know, and I think this was in my head simply because I knew I would be speaking with you today, but I was at my local grocery store and there was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, standing outside, kind of quietly asking people for money for food. Something made me go back and I said to her, you know, are you hungry? Do you want something to eat? And she said, no, really, I could just use a little bit of money. And I normally don't give money, but in this case, I just felt prompted to. And so I did. And then for her to get a meal. And then I turned around and went back to my car. But something made me go back and I went over to her and I said, is somebody making you do this? Has someone told you that you need to stand here and do this? Or are you doing this for yourself? And her eyes just widened, you know, and she said, no, I'm just, you know, I'm staying with friends. And I said, okay, because I could take you somewhere and we could call someone that could help you if someone is making you do this. And she said, no, I'm okay. And then she took off. And now I think, gosh, you know, at least I said to her, you could go in and tell the manager at this store and they will protect you until the police get here. No one will harm you, you know? And, and I haven't been able to get this woman out of my head. And, you know, is it things like this where you just kind of get a sixth sense, or are there, defining characteristics or things that sort of run in general across almost all trafficking victims that you could share with us? Because people want to help, right? I think people's instinct is I think that's one of the reasons Sound of Freedom did as well as it did, because there's nothing that outrages people more than children being exploited in that way, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes there is this sixth sense element that people will just get. You know, unfortunately, people, you know, both men and women, but especially women who are maybe homeless or standing on the street for whatever reason, most likely have been sex trafficked at some point, whether it's happening at that moment or at a different time. Because remember, sex trafficking includes anything of value in exchange. And very unfortunately, there's people who will see someone who's down on their luck, who's having a hard time, and barter, you know, sexual abuse in exchange for a meal, unfortunately.
Yeah, or a place to sleep, I think.
Or a place to sleep. And so certainly anyone who's in that kind of position, whether they have been exploited or currently being exploited, they're certainly at significant risk of it. And so I think there's that, you know, and I think the story that you tell is a really interesting one, because it does show whether that's what that woman's situation or not is, that very often is how those kinds of conversations can go, because maybe a trafficker or pimp was down the street, or maybe that person has a child and is concerned about. So very often people won't immediately ask for help when they're in that kind of situation. So I think you know, reading the situation, but I do think it's good to offer help when you can, to offer resources. You know, sometimes there are different organizations that give out stickers or business cards that have the human trafficking hotline number on it.
Women's bathrooms and things. So say someone else encounters something similar to what I did. Is that an appropriate way to respond, to go in and to say to the store manager, because often people are outside grocery stores panhandling or what have you. And I think we're seeing that even more now with the migrant crisis. Certainly in Chicago, where I live, we have now 10,000 additional people who, you know, we see often. Is that a prudent way to handle it, or does that jeopardize the situation further? What would you recommend if someone sees something like this? And again, I want to be clear, this was an adult. This was clearly a woman in her 20s. This was not a child.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's, you know, it's so case by case. I think you have to read your own comfort as well, whether saying something to the store manager, or if you yourself have a couple business cards that have the human trafficking hotline number on it, or saying something, you know, as simply as you did to your to this woman, just giving the opportunity for a chance for them to say something is good. But I think what you're getting at really illustrates a problem that we have in how our country and like our world responds to this issue of sex trafficking. Because even if, for example, if this woman had agreed and gone with you and gone to a shelter, that would have been incredible. And that's something that we need to do. We need to have services for rehabilitation, and we need to have outreach to victims. But we also need to stop more victims from being created, because unfortunately, the reason why sex trafficking happens in the United States and in any country is because there are men who are willing to purchase another person, whether an adult or a child, for sex. And so that's a really significant issue. And something that our organization really focuses on is trying to find where can we do prevention at a mass scale, because every day new victims are created because there's a demand for it, and there's people who are always going to be willing to groom and exploit other people to make money from that demand. So some things that we think are like really important to do are to speak with companies like Instagram and TikTok and Roblox to have them fix their policies so it's not so easy for adult strangers to contact children online. That would just stop so many, for those young boys on Twitter, they never would have had that experience if an adult stranger wasn't able to contact them online. Or we need legislation that better has stronger penalties for people who are caught buying sex. And we also need, this civil litigation aspect where we go after maybe like a major company, like a social media company that had bad policies or that knew that there was sex trafficking or abuse, and get them to improve and say that they can't just keep operating, kind of allowing it to happen. Because I think, we'll never be able to shore up every crack that a person could fall through, but there's a lot that we see. If we just fix some things at a high level, it could prevent so much harm. Mm-hmm.
What is it then that's driving the trafficking industry? Is it the creation of hardcore porn? Is it people aren't satisfied with porn and they want human beings, rather than images? Do you have a sense of what's at the bottom of the barrel here that's pushing this industry to grow the way it has?
Yeah, unfortunately, men who feel sexual entitlement to another person's body has always existed. So sex trafficking has just existed for eons. But I do believe it has really increased in a significant way in the last maybe decade or so, for two reasons. One, like you mentioned, I think that online hardcore pornography has absolutely increased the demand. It's pushed some men who maybe wouldn't have considered ever purchasing a person in real life. Like you said, there's a lot of research around the brain and pornography, and of course not for everyone who views it, but that for many, research shows that there is an escalation factor, that you need either more extreme material or just more volume of material in order to get the same buzz, for lack of a better word. And for some people, that escalates into either acts of sexual violence or acts of purchasing sex, and maybe both. And of course, that's not everyone who views that material, but the research is very clear. Even the CDC has acknowledged that pornography is linked to issues like sexual violence. So the research is established there. And then also I would say the internet in general, because it used to be that you would have to go to, quote unquote, the wrong side of town. You'd have to go to a street and find someone on the street. There was a bit more risk and skin in the game. But now with the internet, very often, people can just direct message someone on Instagram, or there are sometimes even whole websites dedicated to buying and selling. For a while, Craigslist had very overt ads for purchasing sex. And so this, I think, also has led to it becoming an increased problem.
Well, one of the things your organization has been advocating for nationally is the Kids Online Safety Act, which is currently before Congress. Can you talk a little bit about that and explain what the act would do if it passes and is signed by the president?
Yes. So this is a really important bill. It's essentially focused on regulating social media companies to do more to protect kids online, really just having a set of basic requirements for them to protect minors from online harm. So it's pretty typical. It's not, if you Google it, it's quite interesting because the big tech companies have definitely put out a lot of false information. But really what this does is it provides parents and kids safeguards and tools, like requiring social media platforms to provide minors with better options to protect their own information, the ability to opt out of algorithmic recommendations that can kind of feed into that addictive aspect. And it also creates some accountability. So requiring them to do something to prevent and mitigate harms to minors, especially around issues of like really defined issues. So it's not telling social media companies, to socially engineer kids one way or another, other than very specific issues such as sexual exploitation, self-harm, suicide, eating disorders, and substance abuse. Basically saying on those topics, the social media companies should have some accountability to not let that kind of content and affect kids.
Well, I think one thing that parents aren't aware of generally is how within the education sphere, there have become far more pressing dangers to children, even while they're at school. My husband does IT security for a living and was doing a consultation with a Catholic elementary school and came home and he's like, well, the fifth and sixth grade boys were really at it today. I mean, he has every filter known to God and man were on those computers, but he could also, what he was there to analyze was how many times the boys were trying to do direct hits into hardcore porn sites. And it was significant. I was horrified. And Haley, this was like 5 or 6 years ago. This was not recently. These kids, they weren't just surfing. They know exactly the sites to go on to. And so within institutions of, not higher learning, but elementary schools, parents have to be vigilant. Do you have any tips or suggestions for someone who might be listening here who has an elementary school children, how to inquire, what to ask about at the school in terms of how they maintain online safety for students while they're in the building itself?
Yeah, parents are facing such an uphill battle. It's so overwhelming to be a parent right now. So some things I would recommend are definitely maybe even teacher by teacher asking if they use technology in the classroom or even as part of their homework or class discussions outside of the classroom. There have been teachers who maybe sometimes set up Discord servers or use an app, like there's, I think, an app called Saturn, or different ways that teachers will sometimes try to incorporate technology for education, which is good, but sometimes they do it without setting up safeguards, without setting up parental controls, or maybe the device or the app that your child is using, you don't realize that they're using it, so you aren't able to set up the parental controls. So asking what they're using, but this is a really significant problem, and I think it points to that need for that mass scale prevention, because we do need these companies to be thinking about kids and safety when they're making things. For example, Google Chromebooks, with the pandemic happened and so many people started doing distance learning, and Google Chromebooks started selling millions and millions and millions of their laptops to schools for students. They knew that's who it was going to for distance learning. And they set on no parental controls, no filters, no safety features when they handed it over to the schools. And we went to Google and we said, what the heck? How are you possibly doing this? And they said, well, it's the responsibility of the parents or the families to set up the parental controls and the filters. What teacher has time to figure out the parental controls for 30 plus, laptops? And what parent has the time? It's not an intuitive, you click one box and everything is safe. There's so many steps. There's so many things you have to double check. And then there's still sometimes loopholes. We have a campaign called the Dirty Dozen List, where we name 12 mainstream contributors to sexual exploitation. These are mainstream companies that just aren't doing enough. And we put Google Chromebooks on. And they finally called us and said, okay, we will change it. So with a simple software update, 50 million Google Chromebooks around the world were updated to have their safety features turned on. With a literal flip of a switch, that many children were previously at risk and then were at least better protected. There's still more Google can do, but that's why we need to go, parents, it's good to be aware, to try to learn, have conversations with your teachers, have conversations with your kids, but also you feel overwhelmed because that's fair and you should, and we need to put some of this responsibility on the companies. So the Dirty Dozen List, you can go at dirtydozenlist.com and you can take some simple actions there to help protect your kids and other kids. We have simple forms so you can email or tweet at the companies, and it is really helpful for getting the companies to make a change. So that's
Right.
something else I would recommend that
And
parents
so I
do.
have, I pulled that up actually before I sat down with you today. And so listeners, some of the companies on this Dirty Dozen list are eBay, Instagram, Reddit, Snapchat, Spotify, Twitter, and even the Apple App Store. So dirtydozenlist.com. And we'll link to that in the show notes below, listeners, so that you can just streamline your actions and go right there and then contact some of these companies. But here's, and I'm a lawyer. I'm a big First Amendment proponent of free speech. What is the objection, though, to, for example, Google just putting on a safety, that safety feature, just flipping the switch, and now we have children protected in a way that they weren't. What was the objection to not doing it in the first place?
They just don't realize the demand for it, I think, very often. And I mean, it's kind of interesting. I think there's also sometimes some ideological differences where some people who are making technology have a perspective that people over 13 have complete right to complete privacy and to view and see anything they want online, and that it's wrong to intercept that in any way. But also, they kind of don't understand sometimes the risk that's happening. I mean, it sounds crazy because you think of a company like Google, millions, billions of dollars, but the kind of research they do before they release a new feature or a new product, the risk assessment they do about how could this be exploited, what could we do to make this safer for kids, it's almost non-existent. They really put things out and then see how it impacts people and if people speak up and want it to change. So that's why we think, we generally aren't really calling for boycotts of these companies. Some people might have heard you list some of those apps or platforms and be like, oh no, I can't delete that. But when you speak out and call on the company to do better, it helps them realize that this is a problem.
And that there's that famous phrase by Justice Potter Stewart of the Supreme Court, about the difference between sort of just something that's, sexually provocative and porn. And he said, I know what porn is when I see it. Right. Mm-hmm. So like we have an instinctual understanding of what this is. But in other public spaces outside of schools, there's also the American Library Association, who is opposed to filters. I mean, I don't let my children go to the library by themselves. I have occasionally walked past a computer that, and glance to my side and see what the person is viewing. Yeah. And that there are not filters in these public spaces where children will often be, at least teenagers, whatever, will often be by themselves, right? To study or whatever, to wait for their mom to pick them up from school. Have you had any interactions with the American Library Association on these issues?
They've been on our Dirty Dozen list in the past for exactly what you described. They actually argue and tell librarians that it's against the First Amendment to have any kind of filters on their computers in libraries. But that's actually not true. There was a Supreme Court case that made it very clear that they can filter out pornographic content from libraries. So it's false information that the ALA does put out. And it is a problem. I mean, unfortunately, there are, and if you Google it, you can see there are many instances of people who will go onto these library computers to access child sexual abuse materials as well, in addition to viewing like other explicit content, which can lead to a lot of problems. So it's a big problem.
I have seen numerous testimonies online, particularly of young boys, where there were predators in the library, and they would go, between a certain stack, and a man would just come up and start fondling them. Yeah. And so we know even libraries, at least for a time, were being used. It was fairly well known by police and everyone else that libraries were being used as places where predators knew they could get vulnerable children alone or could call them over and show them the pornography that they were watching online, and, therefore, of course, keep the child's, sexual innocence, destroy it, but also, do something shameful with the child that the child is then afraid to tell the parent. I mean, the level of maniacal manipulation that happens in some of these cases is just extraordinary. And, as you mentioned at the outset, Haley, it's not what people might think of some poor girl being kidnapped, walking to the corner store to get a gallon of milk for her mom. It's actually happening in schools and in these public places that most Americans would trust.
And even in sometimes people's own living room, unfortunately, we know of, there's one case I'm thinking of a young girl who was playing an online video game with the parental controls all turned on, and her mom was in the same room folding laundry next to her. But there was a loophole in those parental controls. So an adult was still able to contact her and begin grooming her for exploitation. So I think, the best things that we can do are, of course, like the children and the friends and community that we have to talk about these issues, to have it be a place without shame or overreactions. So if you find out that your child is speaking to someone you don't know online, try not to freak out because it could make them not want to share. It's like such a delicate thing. And I think, it takes a lot of thought, but trying to have these conversations with our community is so important, educating ourselves that while it doesn't always look like kidnapping and that this can impact all of us in so many different ways. And then also calling on these companies and on laws to do better as well.
And Americans should also, of course, educate themselves. This is a Google search away, but obscenity is not covered by the First Amendment. To Justice Stewart's point, it's not. You don't have a right to be, the government can restrict you from being obscene in public spaces. That is actually a thing. So people should be armed, because I think that is often the first excuse a company or an organization will use, like, oh, well, we can't because of the First Amendment. Well, no, actually you can. And so, and here's how you do it. And I think it would have a supermajority of Americans absolutely agreeing with that there are places that, serve children and serve the general public where this should not be, accessible. And what you do in the privacy of your own home is one thing as an adult, but when children are involved, and especially in vulnerable communities where parents might not be as sophisticated, or English might not be their first language, or it's not spoken at home, all of those things. Well, Haley, as we end up our conversation here and wrap things up, do you have, what would, advice you give to parents of elementary and high school students, or to students themselves who might be listening to this, about how to be aware of traps that, what are some clever ways somebody might try to get them to talk to them online or what have you, but also how can you help another person who you might suspect might be a victim of some kind of trafficking?
Yeah, I think definitely for parents, having conversations with your kid around online safety, especially around sharing images of yourself online, like especially if they might be explicit or compromising in any way. And that's really important, and to do it in a way without shame, and to have multiple conversations about it, because it's something that is a continual threat. So I think it just needs to be part of your regular conversations, unfortunately. I think one resource I would point people towards just for education around things outside of the dirtydozenlist.com, Protect Young Eyes is another organization where all they do is focus on what are the new apps and what are the vulnerabilities. So that's one way to get educated as well as a parent. And as far as, for those who might be experiencing harm, I think trying to be a safe place for people in your community, sharing resources, sharing the human trafficking hotline. And I think that's like one of the best things that we can do as well, in addition to working for better policies at the corporate and government level.
Okay, there's a lot the average parent can do to be a voice. So, well, Haley McNamara, thank you so much for joining us today for this excellent conversation. And we will link to Haley's organization, the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, in the show notes, as well as some of the other organizations and websites that Haley mentioned during our conversation. So you have all of that at your fingertips. Haley, thank you so much again. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. To make it easier for you to listen to future Edify podcast episodes, please make sure you subscribe over at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Thank you.